What if I told you that everything Hollywood showed you about the Wild West was wrong? That the real cowboys rarely drew their guns, that most gunfights never happened at high noon, and that a single egg could cost more than a cowboy made in a week. Tonight, you're about to discover the shocking truth about life in the American frontier. Welcome, my dear friend, to another gentle journey through history. Tonight, we re-traveling back to the American Wild West, but not the romanticized version you've seen in movies. We're going to explore the real, raw, and often heartbreaking reality of life on the frontier between 1850 and 1890. Before we begin this incredible journey together, if you're enjoying these historical bedtime stories, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. It really helps me create more content for you. And if at any point tonight's story helps you relax or learn something new, a gentle tap on the like button would mean the world to me. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's drift back in time together. Picture this. It's 1849, and gold has just been discovered in California. You're standing in Independence, Missouri, watching wagon after wagon line up for what would become one of the most dangerous journeys in American history. The Oregon Trail stretched over 2,000 miles ahead, and only about half of those who started this journey would survive it. The covered wagons, those iconic symbols of the frontier, were actually called prairie schooners because, from a distance, their white canvas tops looked like ships sailing across the grassland sea. Each wagon could carry about 2,500 pounds. But here's something interesting. People rarely rode inside them. The wagons were too full of supplies, and walking alongside was actually easier on both the people and the oxen pulling them. Families would wake at 4 a.m. to the sound of a rifle shot, the signal to start preparing for the day's journey. By 7 a.m., they'd be moving, trying to cover 15 to 20 miles before the heat became unbearable. The dust was so thick that people at the back of the wagon train could barely see, their faces covered with makeshift masks, their eyes red and swollen. Water was precious and often contaminated. Cholera killed more pioneers than any other cause, more than Native American attacks, more than accidents, more than starvation. In fact, I wonder if you knew that your chances of being killed by lightning on the trail were actually higher than being killed in a conflict with Native Americans. Let me know in the comments what surprised you most about these statistics. The children on these journeys lived in a strange mix of adventure and terror. They'd collect buffalo chips for fuel. Yes, dried buffalo dung was their primary source of fire on the treeless plains. They'd play games like graces with wooden hoops and sticks while walking, but they'd also witness death almost daily. Wooden crosses and stone cairns marked graves every few hundred yards women faced particular hardships. Many were pregnant during the journey, giving birth in moving wagons or on the open prairie with no medical help. They decook meals in impossible conditions. Imagine trying to bake bread in a Dutch oven while the wagon bounced over rocks, or making coffee from beans that had to be roasted over buffalo. Chip fires that gave everything a distinctive, unpleasant taste. Now, let's talk about cowboys. The real ones, not the Hollywood version. First, here's a fact that might surprise you. About 1 in 4 cowboys was black, and 1 in 6 was Mexican. The word cowboy itself was originally an insult, implying someone too poor or young to be a proper cattleman. A cowboy's life was far from glamorous. They earned about $25 to $40 per month. That's roughly $800 in today's money for dangerous, back-breaking work. They'd spend 18 hours a day in the saddle during cattle drives, developing permanent bow legs and chronic back problems. Their diet consisted mainly of beans, dried beef, and hardtack biscuits. So hard, they had to be soaked in water or coffee to be edible. The famous cattle drives from Texas to Kansas took about 3 months, moving herds of 2,000 to 3,000 longhorn cattle. Cowboys worked in shifts through the night, singing softly to keep the cattle calm. These weren't performances, they were practical. A spooked herd could stampede, and a stampede at night was every cowboy's worst nightmare. Men died, crushed under thousands of hooves, their bodies sometimes never found in the prairie grass. Here's something Hollywood never shows. Most cowboys couldn't afford guns. A Colt .45 cost about $20, nearly a month's wages. Those who did carry weapons usually had old, unreliable pieces that were more likely to misfire than shoot straight. The famous quick-draw gunfights, they almost never happened. Most shootings were ambushes or drunken brawls, not honorable duels in the street. Cowboys bathed maybe once a month, if they were lucky. They'd develop lice, fleas, and painful saddle sores. Their clothes would literally rot off their bodies from sweat and dirt. When they finally reached a town, after months on the trail, they'd spend most of their earnings in just a few days on baths, new clothes, alcohol, and gambling. The women of the Wild West faced challenges that would break most people today. Forget the dance hall girls and madams that dominate popular culture. Let us talk about the ordinary women. A typical frontier wife would wake at 4 a.m. to start the fire, and making fire was unsimple. Without matches, too expensive for daily use, they'd carefully maintain coals from the previous day or use flint and steel. If the fire went out, they might have to walk miles to a neighbor to borrow hot coals. Washing clothes was a 2-day ordeal. Monday was for soaking and scrubbing, on washboards that left hands raw and bleeding. The lye soap they made from animal fat and ashes was so harsh it could burn skin. Tuesday was for rinsing, wringing, and hanging. In winter, clothes would freeze solid on the line, and women's hands would crack and bleed from the cold. Childbirth was terrifying. With no doctors for hundreds of miles, women relied on midwives if they were lucky, or faced birth alone if they weren't. The maternal mortality rate was about 1 in 100 births. Does unsound high until you realize women averaged 7 to 10 pregnancies. Many women wrote their wills when they discovered they were pregnant. But here, what remarkable. Women found ways to create community and culture in this harsh landscape. They organized schools, churches, and social events. They started literary societies where they'd share the few books available, reading them aloud to each other. They preserved their families' histories in detailed diaries that give us our best glimpses into frontier life today. Are you still with me? If you're finding this journey through real history fascinating, please leave a comment about what aspect of frontier life you'd like to know more about. Your engagement helps me understand what stories to tell next. The mining boom towns of the Wild West were perhaps the harshest places to live in American history. Towns like Deadwood, Tombstone, and Virginia City sprang up overnight when gold or silver was discovered, and they were exactly as lawless as you've heard. Maybe worse. In 1859, when the Comstock lode was discovered in Nevada, Virginia City grew from nothing to 30,000 people in just a few years. But here's what that really meant. There were about 100 men for every woman. There was no sewage system, no clean water, and no law enforcement for the first several years. Miners worked in conditions that would be illegal today. They descend hundreds of feet underground in cages that dropped so fast their ears would bleed from the pressure change. At the bottom, temperatures could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men worked naked, except for boots and helmets, drinking gallons of water mixed with vinegar to replace lost salts. Cave-ins were common. Men died from falling rocks, explosions, fires, and poisonous gases. The few who struck it rich usually lost everything just as quickly. A meal in a mining town could cost $25, remember? That was a cowboy's monthly wage. A single egg might cost $3. Flour was literally worth its weight in gold dust in some camps. Merchants made far more money than miners. Levi Strauss got rich selling pants, not panning for gold. Violence was endemic. In Bodie, California, there was a murder every week in a town of only 5,000 people. Bodies would freeze in the winter and couldn't be buried until spring thaw. The cemetery grew so fast that it was divided into sections, one for decent folks one for Chinese immigrants, racism was brutal and systemic, and one for prostitutes and gamblers. Speaking of the Chinese immigrants, they made up a huge portion of the mining workforce, but faced terrible discrimination. They were forced to pay special taxes, banned from owning claims, and often could only work sites that white miners had abandoned. Yet they developed ingenious techniques for extracting gold from worthless claims and built thriving communities despite the oppression. We cannot talk about the Wild West without acknowledging the devastating impact on Native American peoples. This isn't just history. It's a tragedy that still affects millions today. By 1890, only about 250,000 remained. Some tribes lost 90% of their population to disease alone. The destruction of the buffalo herds was deliberate genocide. In 1800, about 60 million buffalo roamed the Great Plains. By 1889, fewer than 1,000 remained. The U.S. Army encouraged the slaughter, with General Philip Sheridan saying, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated. Then your prairies can be covered with cattle and the cowboy." Native Americans were forced onto reservations that were usually on the worst land available. The government promises of food and supplies were routinely broken. In winter 1883 to 84, on the Pine Ridge Reservation, 500 Lakota died of starvation while government warehouses sat full of food just miles away. The agents selling the supplies for personal profit instead of distributing them. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools designed to kill the Indian, save the man. They were forbidden to speak their languages, practice their religions, or even use their real names. The trauma from these schools affects Native communities to this day. The resistance leaders we know, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Geronimo, were fighting for their people's survival, not just their land. When Sitting Bull was killed in 1890, he was living in a cabin on the reservation, trying to farm land that couldn't grow anything, watching his people starve. The myth of the heroic sheriff bringing law to lawless towns is mostly that, a myth. Real law enforcement in the Wild West was chaotic, corrupt, and often more dangerous than the criminals. Take the famous Wyatt Earp. Yes, he was a lawman in Tombstone, but he was also a gambler, saloon owner, and possibly a pimp. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral lasted about 30 seconds and was more like a gang fight than a heroic stand for justice. Earp and his brothers were charged with murder afterward, but were acquitted in a trial many considered fixed. Most towns couldn't afford professional lawmen. They relied on vigilance committees, basically lynch mobs with pretensions of legitimacy. In Montana, in 1884, vigilantes hanged 35 people in 6 weeks, many without any trial at all. One man was hanged for stealing a horse he had actually purchased, but he couldn't prove it fast enough to satisfy the mob. Wild Bill Hickok, another famous lawman, killed most of his victims by shooting them in the back or ambushing them. His reputation for fast-draw dueling was mostly self-promotion. He was eventually shot in the back of the head while playing poker, holding what became known as the dead man's hand, aces and eights. The real heroes were often ordinary citizens who stood up to violence. Store owners who refused to pay protection money, women who testified against powerful men despite threats, and journalists who exposed corruption even when it meant risking their lives. If you're still listening, you're amazing. Quick question for the comments. What surprised you most about the reality of Wild West law enforcement? And if you're enjoying this deep dive into real history, that like button really helps the channel grow. Medicine in the Wild West was a terrifying mix of folk remedies, dangerous drugs, and occasional real science. Most doctors had no formal training. Anyone could hang out a shingle and start practicing. Whiskey was the universal medicine. It was used as an anesthetic for surgery, a treatment for snake bites, a cure for colds, and a palliative for everything else. Laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, was given to everyone from teething babies to dying grandparents. Addiction was rampant, but rarely recognized as such. Surgery was performed without anesthesia more often than with it. Patients were held down by strong men while doctors operated with unsterilized tools. The survival rate for amputations was about 50%. For gunshot wounds to the abdomen, it was less than 10%. Dentistry was even worse. Traveling dentists would set up in saloons, pulling teeth with pliers while the patient was drunk enough not to care. There was no Novocaine, just whiskey and a leather strap to bite on. Patent medicines were everywhere, sold by traveling salesmen with elaborate shows. These medicines were usually alcohol mixed with herbs, cocaine, or morphine. They didn't cure anything, but they made people feel better temporarily. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, given to babies, contained morphine. Coca-Cola originally contained actual cocaine. Disease spread rapidly in frontier towns with no sanitation. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery killed more people than violence ever did. In 1878, a yellow fever epidemic killed 5,000 people in Memphis alone. Bodies were stacked in the streets because there weren't enough people alive to bury them. But there were real heroes too. Sister Blandina Seagale, a Catholic nun, traveled alone through the most dangerous parts of New Mexico and Colorado, treating gunshot wounds, delivering babies, and facing down lynch mobs. Doc Susie Anderson practiced medicine in the Colorado mountains for 47 years, often traveling through blizzards on skis to reach patients. By the 1890s, the Wild West was dying. The railroads had connected the coasts, bringing civilization and its constraints. Barbed wire, invented in 1867 ended the open range. The federal government declared the frontier closed in 1890. The last great land rush was in Oklahoma in 1889. At noon on April 22nd, 50,000 people raced to claim 2 million acres of land. By sunset, Oklahoma City had 10,000 residents living in tents. But this wasn't the romantic frontier of imagination. It was chaos. People were shot over disputed claims. Many of the Sooners who sneaked in early to claim the best land were government officials who used their positions to cheat. The invention of refrigerated railroad cars in the 1870s meant beef could be processed in Chicago and shipped east, ending the great cattle drives. Cowboys became ranch hands, working for wages on fenced land. The romance was gone, replaced by industrial agriculture. Many of the famous outlaws met mundane ends. Jesse James was shot by a member of his own gang for reward money. Butch Cassidy probably died in a shootout in Bolivia, though some say he returned to America and lived quietly until 1937. Billy the Kid was shot while unarmed in a dark room, not in a dramatic showdown. The Native American resistance ended at Wounded Knee in 1890, where the 7th Cavalry killed about 300 Lakota, mostly women and children. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. 20 soldiers received the Medal of Honor for their participation, a bitter irony that stands to this day. Let me paint you a picture of daily life that Hollywood never shows. Wake up in your one-room cabin at 4 a.m. The temperature inside is below freezing because the fire died overnight. Your water bucket is frozen solid. You break the ice with an axe and put the bucket near the fire. You retrying to restart with numb fingers. Breakfast is cornmeal mush if you're lucky, hardtack and water if you're not. Coffee is made from chicory or roasted grains. Real coffee is too expensive. You sweeten it with molasses because sugar costs a fortune. Your clothes are the same ones you've worn for weeks. You own 2 sets if you're well off, one for work, one for Sunday. They're patched and repatched until there's more patch than original fabric. Your boots have holes that you've stuffed with newspaper or grass. If you're a man, you might shave once a week with a straight razor that you sharpen on a leather strop. One slip and you're scarred for life. If you're a woman, your hair is your crown, but washing it is a major undertaking involving rainwater, homemade soap, and hours of drying time. Entertainment is what you make yourself. People would walk 10 miles to attend a dance where the music was one fiddle and the floor was hard-packed dirt. Books were so precious, they were read aloud repeatedly until everyone had them memorized. A traveling theater troupe was the event of the year. Children's toys were handmade. Corn husk dolls, wooden whistles, hoops from barrels, They played games like ante-over, throwing a ball over the house and running around to catch it. But childhood was short. By age 10, most children were doing adult work. School, when it existed, was in a one-room building with all ages together. The teacher, usually an unmarried woman, earned about $30 a month and was required to remain single. She'd board with different families, never having privacy or a home of her own. The diet of the average frontier family would horrify modern nutritionists. In winter, it might be nothing but salt, pork, beans, and cornbread for months. Scurvy was common. Children's teeth would become loose from vitamin C deficiency. Preserving food was a constant battle. Without refrigeration, meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried immediately after slaughter. Salt was expensive, so people used massive amounts to ensure preservation. The resulting meat was so salty it had to be soaked for hours before cooking. A frontier wife might spend an entire day making bread for the week. First, she'd have to maintain a sourdough starter. Commercial yeast was unavailable. The process involved multiple rises, and if the temperature wasn't right, the bread would fail. Failed bread meant hardtack, flour, and water baked into rocks that lasted forever but could break teeth. Milk was a luxury. If you had a cow, you'd spend hours churning butter, making cheese, and trying to keep milk cool enough not to spoil immediately. Many children grew up never tasting fresh milk. Living on milk made from mixing water with chalk or plaster of Paris, sold by unscrupulous merchants. Vegetables were almost impossible to keep. Frontier families might go 6 months without fresh vegetables, leading to numerous health problems. When spring finally came, people would desperately eat dandelion greens, wild onions, and anything green they could find. Water was often contaminated. Wells were dug near outhouses, leading to typhoid and cholera. People drank alcohol not for pleasure, but because it was safer than water. Children drank small beer, low alcohol, because it wouldn't kill them like bad water would. Let's destroy some myths about the famous gunfighters. Wild Bill Hickok killed fewer than 10 men in his entire life, not the hundreds claimed by dime novels. His famous shootout with Davis Tutt was over a pocket watch, not exactly noble. John Wesley Hardin, who claimed to have killed 42 men, was a psychopath who once shot a man for snoring. He was unromantic anti-hero. He was a murderer who shot many of his victims in the back or while they were unarmed. The image of 2 gunfighters facing off at high noon. It almost never happened. Most shootings were at night, in saloons, with both parties drunk. Accuracy with period revolvers was terrible. Most shots missed, even at close range. The smoke from black powder would fill a room after a few shots, making it impossible to see. Here's a detail you never see in movies: gun belts worn low on the hips, like Hollywood shows, would fall down when you walked. Real gunfighters wore their guns high on the waist or in shoulder holsters. The famous fast draw was invented for Wild West shows in the 1900s. Doc Holliday, the infamous gunfighter, was a dentist dying of tuberculosis. He went west hoping the dry climate would help his lungs. His reputation was built on maybe 3 or 4 actual gunfights. He spent most of his time gambling and coughing up blood. Are you finding these myth-busting facts interesting? What Western movie would you like to know the truth about? Let me know in the comments. Winter on the frontier was a killer. The winter of 1886 to 87, known as the Great Dup, killed about 90% of the cattle on the open range. Cowboys found cattle frozen, standing up. Others had drifted with the wind until they hit a fence and died in piles hundreds deep. Frontier families would literally live with their livestock in winter. They'd bring chickens, pigs, and sometimes even cows into their homes, because a frozen animal was a dead animal. Imagine the smell, the noise, the disease. Firewood had to be cut in summer and stored. A family might need 20 cords of wood to survive a Great Plains winter. If they miscalculated or had an especially harsh winter, they'd burn furniture, books, anything combustible. Some families froze to death just feet from their neighbors, too proud to ask for help. Cabin fever was real and dangerous. Families were trapped together for months in tiny spaces. Domestic violence increased. Suicide rates spiked. Some people simply walked out into blizzards and were never seen again. Children would be tied to ropes when going to the outhouse so they could find their way back in a blizzard. People got lost and froze to death just yards from their own doors, unable to see through the snow. Food monotony drove people to distraction. The same meal every day for months. Salt, pork, and beans. Salt, pork, and beans. Some women reported dreaming about vegetables, waking up crying from wanting fresh food so badly. The economy of most frontier towns was built on vice. Saloons, gambling halls, and brothels were the main businesses. Prostitution was one of the few ways women could earn independent income. A prostitute could make in a night what a seamstress made in a month. But the life was brutal. Disease, violence, and drug addiction killed most within 5 years. The average age of death for frontier prostitutes was 23. Gambling was everywhere and usually rigged. Faro, the most popular game, gave the house such an advantage that it was called the Widowmaker. Professional gamblers would work in teams to fleece newcomers, using marked cards, loaded dice, and complicated con games. Alcohol consumption was staggering. The average American drank about 7 gallons of pure alcohol per year, 3 times today's rate. But frontier towns consumed even more. Whiskey was often contaminated with tobacco juice, turpentine, and even strychnine to give it kick. Opium dens operated openly in many Western towns. Chinese immigrants were blamed for opium use, but the majority of addicts were white women hooked on laudanum and patent medicines. Addiction was seen as a moral failing, not a medical condition. The temperance movement grew from the real devastation alcohol caused. Women and children were often left destitute by drinking husbands and fathers. Carrie Nation, famous for destroying saloons with a hatchet, had lost her first husband to alcoholism. The Transcontinental Railroad was built on the backs of exploited workers. Chinese workers for the Central Pacific were paid $1 a day and had to provide their own food. Irish workers for the Union Pacific got $3 a day, but spent most of it on company-provided whiskey and lodging. The death toll was staggering. Nobody knows exactly how many Chinese workers died building through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Estimates range from hundreds to thousands. They were lowered in baskets to place dynamite on cliff faces. If the rope broke or the charge went off early, they disappeared without a trace. Workers lived in camps that moved with the railroad. These hell-on-wheels towns were lawless, violent places where workers were robbed of their wages as soon as they were paid. Murder was so common it wasn't even investigated unless the victim was important. The railroad companies were given millions of acres of land by the government, land that belonged to Native American tribes. The companies then sold this land to settlers at huge profits. The corruption was enormous. The credit mobilier scandal showed that the railroad companies had bribed most of Congress. When the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit in 1869, it was celebrated as uniting the nation. But for Native Americans, it was the final nail in the coffin of their traditional way of life. For Chinese workers, it meant being immediately fired and forbidden from riding the trains they'd built. Justice on the frontier was often just revenge with a thin veneer of legality. Judge Roy Bean, the law west of the Pecos, held court in his saloon, often fining defendants the exact amount of money they had on them. He once fined a dead man $40 for carrying a concealed weapon. The $40 found in the corpse's pocket. Lynching was common, and not just in the South. Between 1882 and 1968, Montana had the highest per capita rate of lynching in the nation. Victims were hanged for crimes as minor as horse theft, or sometimes for no crime at all, beyond being the wrong race in the wrong place. Women had almost no legal rights. They couldn't vote, own property if married, or serve on juries. A woman who killed her abusive husband would hang, but a man who killed his wife in a crime of passion often walked free. Children could be imprisoned with adults. In 1885, a 10-year-old boy was sentenced to life in prison in Wyoming for murder. He served 11 years before being pardoned. There were no juvenile courts, no consideration for age or circumstances. The prison system was barbaric. Yuma Territorial Prison in Arizona was called the hellhole. Prisoners were chained in cells carved from solid rock, where temperatures reached 120 degrees. Many went insane from the heat and isolation. But sometimes, frontier justice got it right in ways the formal system didn't. Some communities successfully used banishment instead of hanging, giving criminals a horse, a gun, and a warning never to return. It wasn't perfect, but it was often more humane than the alternative. The environmental damage done during the frontier period was catastrophic. Hydraulic mining in California washed entire mountains into rivers, flooding farmland hundreds of miles away with toxic sediment. Some areas still haven't recovered 150 years later. The passenger pigeon, once the most numerous bird in North America, was hunted to extinction. The last one died in 1914. Market hunters would kill thousands in a day, shipping them east packed in barrels of salt. Forests were clear-cut without any thought for replanting. The Great Michigan Fire of 1871 burned 2.5 million acres and killed 1,500 people. It was caused by drought and the massive amounts of logging waste left in the forests. Rivers were treated as sewers. The Chicago River was so polluted with animal waste from the stockyards that it caught fire multiple times. Cities downstream complained their drinking water tasted like beef blood. The prairies were plowed under, destroying one of the world's great ecosystems. The deep roots of prairie grasses that had held the soil for millennia were replaced with shallow-rooted crops. This led directly to the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Mining towns poisoned everything around them. Mercury used in gold processing contaminated water for generations. Smelter smoke killed everything for miles downwind. Butte, Montana's Berkeley Pit, is still one of the most toxic places in America, filled with water that can dissolve metal. The myth of the Wild West was being created even as the real West existed. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show toured the world, presenting a completely fictional version of frontier life. Sitting Bull, the great Lakota leader, performed in the show for money because his people were starving on the reservation. Dime novels portrayed outlaws as heroes and lawmen as noble crusaders. The real Jesse James was a Confederate guerrilla who robbed trains and banks, killing innocent people. But in the novels, he was Robin Hood, stealing from the rich to give to the poor. The myth of the savage Indian was used to justify genocide. Native Americans were portrayed as bloodthirsty warriors, when most tribes were peaceful farmers or hunters just trying to survive. The Indian attacks on wagon trains that dominate Western movies, they were rare. Natives were more likely to trade with pioneers than attack them. The cowboy myth is perhaps the most persistent. In reality, cowboys were mostly poor, illiterate laborers doing dangerous, dirty work. But the myth transformed them into knights of the prairie, independent heroes living by a code of honor. Women in the myth were either pure schoolmarms or fallen dance hall girls. The reality was far more complex. Women were doctors, business owners, ranchers, and newspaper editors. They were also mothers, trying to keep their children alive in impossible conditions. The myth serves a purpose. It gives us heroes and villains, clear moral lessons, and a sense of adventure. But it also obscures the real suffering, the real heroism, and the real lessons we should learn from this period. If you're still with me, you're incredible. We're coming to the end of our journey. What myth about the Wild West were you most surprised to see debunked? The frontier period lasted only about 40 years, but its impact on American culture is immeasurable. The idea of the self-made man comes from the frontier, where supposedly anyone could strike it rich or build an empire from nothing. In reality, most who went west ended up poorer than they started. The environmental devastation of the frontier period set patterns that continued for decades. The attitude that nature was inexhaustible and existed only to be exploited led to disasters that we're still dealing with today. The treatment of Native Americans during this period created generational trauma that continues. Poverty, addiction, and suicide rates on reservations today are direct results of policies enacted during the frontier period. The myth of redemptive violence, the idea that problems are best solved with guns, comes from the frontier myth. This has had profound effects on American culture and politics that continue today. But there were positive legacies, too. The frontier produced a spirit of innovation and adaptation. People had to solve problems with whatever was at hand. This pragmatic creativity became part of American culture. Women's suffrage movements were strongest in Western states. Wyoming was the first state to grant women the vote in 1869, partly because they needed women to move there, and partly because frontier life had shown that women were just as capable as men. As we come to the end of our journey through the real Wild West, I hope you've gained a new appreciation for the complexity of this period. It wasn't the romantic adventure of movies, nor was it purely brutal and hopeless. It was human beings trying to survive and thrive in incredibly difficult circumstances. The real heroes weren't the gunfighters or the outlaws. They were the ordinary people who built schools and churches, who helped their neighbors through hard winters, who stood up to injustice even when it was dangerous. They were the women who kept families together, the children who survived to adulthood. The immigrants who built new lives despite discrimination. The Wild West reminds us that history is never simple. It's not good guys versus bad guys, civilization versus wilderness, progress versus tradition. It's complex, messy, and human. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps dream not of gunfights and gold rushes, but of the real human stories. The mother teaching her children to read by candlelight. The cowboy singing to cattle under the stars. The Chinese railroad worker sending money home to family he'd never see again. The Native American chief trying to save something of his people's way of life. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through real history. If you enjoyed discovering the truth behind the myths, please consider subscribing to the channel for more gentle history stories. Hit that like button if this video helped you relax or learn something new. It really helps me know what kind of content you enjoy. What period of history would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments below. I read every single one. Goodbye.